I'm sitting on the floor of Cancun International Airport with my suitcase and a backpack, staring at my phone screen showing transaction declined for the fourth time. The ticket counter agent just told me the cheapest flight to Dallas is $847. I have $23 in my bank account. Around me, families are heading to their gates, couples are buying overpriced coffee, and here I am, a 59-year-old man who 6 months ago owned 3 properties in Mexico, trying to figure out how to get home. The security guard keeps walking past, giving me looks. I know what he's thinking. Another broke American who thought paradise was cheap. 6 months earlier, I was standing in my real estate office in Denver, signing the papers to sell the last of my business assets. I'd just gone through the worst year of my life. 32 years of marriage ended when Susan filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, which translated to her realizing she didn't want to spend retirement with someone who worked 70-hour weeks and barely talked to her anymore. The settlement left me with $340,000 in cash and a fresh start I didn't want, but desperately needed. I was 58, officially retired from running a small commercial real estate firm, and completely lost about what came next. My kids lived their own lives in other states. My ex-wife got the house we'd built together. I was renting a studio apartment and eating cereal for dinner most nights. Not because I couldn't afford better food, but because cooking for one felt pointless. That's when my neighbor Carlos, a guy who'd moved back to the States from Playa del Carmen 5 years earlier, started telling me stories about Mexico. "Brother," he'd say over beers on his porch, "you could buy a condo there for what you're paying in rent here. Live like a king on what you've got saved. The weather's perfect, the people are incredible, and your money goes 5 times further." He showed me photos on his phone. White sand beaches, crystal blue water, modern condos that looked like they belonged in Miami but cost a fraction of the price. I only came back because of my kids' school situation. If I was single, I'd still be there. The idea consumed me for weeks. I started researching online, joining Facebook groups for American expats in Mexico, watching YouTube videos about the cost of living in the Riviera Maya. The numbers were compelling. I could rent a 2-bedroom condo 3 blocks from the beach for $1,200 a month. Groceries cost half what they did in Denver. Healthcare was affordable and modern. With $340,000 in savings, I could live comfortably for decades without working, maybe even buy some properties to rent to tourists and supplement my income. In February 2023, I booked a 2-week scouting trip to Playa del Carmen. The moment I stepped off the plane in Cozumel and felt that warm Caribbean air, something inside me relaxed for the first time in months. The ferry ride across to Playa del Carmen felt like entering a different world. Palm trees, turquoise water, and a pace of life that didn't revolve around conference calls and profit margins. I rented a small apartment through Airbnb for those 2 weeks, right in the heart of Playa. Every morning, I'd walk to a cafe called Cafe Amor for coffee and fresh pastries that cost less than a gas station sandwich back home. The owner, an older Mexican woman named Rosa, would practice her English with me while I practiced my terrible Spanish with her. Within a week, she was saving me the best croissants and treating me like family. The beaches were everything Carlos had promised. I'd spend afternoons reading books I'd bought years ago but never had time to open, watching pelicans dive for fish and couples walking hand in hand along the shore. For the first time since my divorce, I felt something approaching peace. The idea of going back to Denver, to that studio apartment and those silent dinners, made my stomach turn. I spent the second week looking at real estate. That's when I met Isabella Morales, a licensed real estate agent who specialized in helping American buyers. She was 34, spoke perfect English, and had lived in California for several years before moving back to Mexico to be closer to her family. Professional, knowledgeable, and patient with all my questions about the buying process for foreigners. The key, she explained over lunch at a beachfront restaurant, is finding properties in the right areas. Not tourist traps, but places where locals actually want to live too. That's where you get the best value and the most stable rental income. She showed me a portfolio of condos and small houses, all priced between $120,000 and $180,000, in neighborhoods I'd never heard of, but that looked clean and well maintained. Isabella drove me around in her SUV, pointing out the infrastructure developments, the new shopping centers being built, the hotel chains investing in the area. This whole region is growing fast, she said, but it's still early enough to get in at good prices. In 5 years, these properties will be worth double. By the end of my trip, I'd put down a $5,000 deposit on a 2-bedroom condo in a development called Residential Palmeras, about 10 minutes inland from the beach. The total price was $165,000, and Isabella walked me through every step of the process: how to set up a Mexican bank account, how to wire money safely, how to handle the closing documents. She even recommended a lawyer, an English-speaking guy named Eduardo, who'd handled dozens of transactions for American buyers. I flew back to Denver with a plan: sell everything, move to Mexico, buy the condo, and start fresh. Maybe buy another property or two as rentals. At 58, with no debt and solid savings, I could build something new. That's when I made my first mistake. I was so excited about the move that I started making emotional decisions instead of logical ones. Within 3 weeks of returning from Mexico, I'd given notice on my apartment, sold my car, and booked a one-way ticket back to Playa del Carmen. I convinced myself that speed was important, that property prices were rising so fast I needed to act quickly. Isabella met me at the airport when I arrived in March, holding a sign with my name and smiling like we were old friends. She'd found me a furnished rental apartment for $1,100 a month while I waited for my condo purchase to finalize. It usually takes 60 to 90 days, she explained as we drove through the familiar streets. The Mexican system is very thorough, but it moves slowly. Don't worry, everything is progressing normally. The first month was everything I'd hoped for. I established routines, learned basic Spanish from a tutor Isabella recommended, explored restaurants and beach clubs I couldn't afford back home. The weather was perfect, my rental apartment was comfortable, and I felt genuinely happy for the first time in months. Isabella and I started spending more time together outside of business. She'd show me local places tourists never found, translate when I got confused at the bank or grocery store, explain cultural differences that helped me fit in better. She was easy to be around, intelligent, funny, and genuinely interested in helping me adjust to my new life. When she invited me to a family barbecue at her sister's house, I felt honored to be included. Her relatives were warm and welcoming, even though my Spanish was terrible and their English was limited. Isabella translated, laughed at my jokes, and made sure I felt comfortable. After 2 months, our relationship shifted from professional to personal. It happened gradually, naturally. Dinner dates turned into beach walks. Business meetings turned into afternoons exploring cenotes and Mayan ruins. Isabella was different from anyone I'd dated. Grounded, family-oriented, with a clear sense of what she wanted from life. She'd built her real estate business from nothing, supported her parents, and still maintained close relationships with her siblings and their kids. "I like that you're starting over," she told me one evening as we watched the sunset from a rooftop bar. "Most men your age, they think they have everything figured out already. You're still curious about the world, still willing to learn new things." The compliment meant more to me than she probably realized. Susan had made me feel like I was set in my ways, boring, predictable. Isabella made me feel interesting again, but everything changed when my condo purchase hit complications. Eduardo, the lawyer, called to explain that there were title issues with Residential Palmeras. Nothing serious, he assured me, but it would delay closing by several months while they resolved some paperwork problems with the previous owners. My $5,000 deposit was safe, but I'd be renting longer than expected. Isabella suggested I look at other properties while I waited. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, she said. The market is moving fast. If you find something better, we can always transfer your deposit. That made sense to me. I'd come to Mexico to invest in real estate, not to sit around waiting for bureaucrats to file papers. Over the next few weeks, Isabella showed me dozens of properties. A 3-bedroom house in a gated community for $220,000. A beachfront condo in Tulum for $280,000. A small apartment building with 4 units that could generate $3,000 a month in rental income for $320,000. The numbers all looked good on paper, and Isabella's enthusiasm was infectious. This is how you build real wealth in Mexico, she explained, showing me spreadsheets on her laptop. Buy multiple properties, rent them to tourists and long-term residents. Let the appreciation and cash flow compound over time. American retirees who did this 5 years ago are millionaires now. I should have seen what was coming, but I was caught up in the excitement of being an investor again. Back in Denver, I'd bought and sold commercial properties for 30 years. I understood markets, cash flow, cap rates, but this felt different, more dynamic. Isabella would find a property, show me the rental projections, and within days we'd have an accepted offer. By September 2023, 6 months after arriving in Mexico, I owned 3 properties on paper. The original condo in residential Palmeras, still delayed but moving forward. A 2-bedroom house in a residential neighborhood for $190,000. And a 1-bedroom beachfront condo for $240,000. Total investment, $595,000, including closing costs, renovations, and furniture. I transferred most of my life savings to my Mexican bank account to fund the purchases. Isabella handled everything, coordinating with contractors for renovations, setting up property management for rentals, dealing with utilities and insurance. She introduced me to her network of trusted professionals. A handyman who could fix anything for reasonable prices. A housekeeper who would maintain the properties between renters. A property manager who would handle bookings and guest services for a 15% commission. We were also planning a future together. Isabella had essentially moved into my rental apartment, though she kept her own place for appearances. Her family had accepted me completely. I'd started learning Spanish seriously, taking formal classes and practicing with her relatives. We talked about marriage, about combining our resources to build a real estate portfolio that could support both of us long term. You have the capital, she'd say, running her fingers through my hair as we lay on the beach. I have the local knowledge and connections. Together we can build something incredible. It felt like the partnership I'd never had in my marriage with Susan. Shared goals, complementary skills, mutual respect. The first property generated rental income immediately. The beachfront condo booked solid through the winter season at $180 a night. Even after property management fees, utilities and maintenance, it was cash flowing $2,800 a month. Isabella showed me the booking confirmations, the payment receipts, the glowing reviews from guests. This is just the beginning, she said. Wait until we have 5 or 6 properties running like this. I should have been more hands-on with the finances, but I was in love. Not just with Isabella, but with the whole lifestyle. I was 59 years old, living in paradise, making money from real estate, and building a relationship with a woman who made me feel like the best version of myself. Why would I want to micromanage the details when everything was working so well? That winter, Isabella proposed we buy 2 more properties. A 4-bedroom house we could market to larger groups and families, and a small commercial space we could convert into a cafe or boutique. The commercial property is the real opportunity, she explained, showing me foot traffic studies and revenue projections. Tourist areas like this, the right business can make $10,000 a month profit easily. The house cost $275,000. The commercial space cost $180,000, including renovation costs for both properties. The total investment was $520,000. I had to liquidate my remaining US investments and transfer another $300,000 to Mexico to cover the down payments and closing costs. Isabella assured me the numbers worked. With 5 rental properties and a small business, we'd be generating over $15,000 a month in combined income. I signed the paperwork in February 2024, almost exactly 1 year after my first scouting trip. On paper, I owned $1.1 million worth of Mexican real estate and had about $40,000 left in liquid savings. Isabella and I celebrated with a weekend trip to Isla Mujeres, staying in a luxury resort I would never have been able to afford as a single man living off retirement savings. Next year at this time, Isabella said, raising her margarita as we watched the sunset from our balcony, we'll be married and financially independent. You'll never have to worry about money again. 3 days later, my world collapsed. I woke up that Tuesday morning to find Isabella gone from the apartment, along with her clothes, her laptop, and several important documents I kept in a folder by my desk. Property deeds, bank statements, contract copies. There was a note on the kitchen counter written in her neat handwriting. I'm sorry it had to end this way. Please don't try to find me. I called her phone immediately. Disconnected. I drove to her real estate office. Closed, with a for rent sign in the window. I went to her sister's house where I'd been welcomed for family dinners dozens of times. No one answered the door, but I could see people moving around inside. That's when the panic really set in. I rushed to the bank to check my accounts. Empty. All of them. Over $650,000 transferred out over the previous 3 months through a series of transactions I'd never authorized, but that somehow bore my digital signature. I demanded to see the branch manager, showed them my identification, insisted there had been fraud. Sir, the manager said in careful English, these transfers were all authorized through your online banking account. The digital signatures match your registered signature with us. We have no record of fraud or unauthorized access. I went to Eduardo, the lawyer's office, also closed, with no forwarding information. I hired a different lawyer, a guy recommended by the American consulate, and showed him all my documentation, property deeds, purchase contracts, rental agreements, everything I thought proved I owned 5 properties in Mexico. I'm very sorry, he said after reviewing everything, but according to the Mexican property records, you don't own any of these properties. The deeds were never properly transferred to your name. Legally, you have no claim to any of these assets. The fake property management company had been collecting rental income from properties I thought I owned, but never actually did. The construction and renovation work I'd paid for had been done on properties that belonged to other people. The rental income statements Isabella had shown me were completely fabricated. I'd been living in Mexico for almost a year, paying rent on an apartment, eating at restaurants, taking Spanish classes, building what I thought was a new life, while my money disappeared through a carefully orchestrated fraud that I'd participated in willingly. I'd signed every document, authorized every transfer, agreed to every investment, because I trusted the woman I thought I was going to marry. The worst part was how systematic it had been. Isabella hadn't just stolen my money. She'd studied me, understood exactly what I wanted to hear, and fed me a perfect fantasy. A successful business partnership with someone who loved me. Financial security through real estate investments in a market I didn't understand. A ready-made social circle through her family connections. Everything I'd been missing in my life back in Denver. When I tried to report the fraud to Mexican police, they were polite but unhelpful. This appears to be a civil matter, the officer explained through a translator. You voluntarily transferred money and signed contracts. If you believe you were deceived, you can pursue it through the courts, but that will take years and cost more money than you probably have. The American consulate was more sympathetic, but equally limited in what they could do. Unfortunately, this kind of fraud targeting American retirees is not uncommon. The consular officer told me, "We can help you contact family members if you need assistance getting home, but we can't help you recover the money." I had $40,000 left in my US bank account, but most of that was tied up in a CD that would cost me a penalty to access early. My credit cards were maxed out from living expenses over the previous year. I had no property to sell, no business to liquidate, no assets except the clothes in my suitcase, and a return ticket I couldn't afford to change to an earlier date. That's how I ended up sleeping in Cancun Airport for 3 days, trying to figure out how to get home with $23 to my name. The Mexican authorities were patient but firm about not letting me sleep in the terminal indefinitely. The American consulate eventually helped me contact my sister in Phoenix, who agreed to wire money for a flight home. When I finally landed in Denver, everything looked exactly the same, but I felt like a different person entirely. I'd left as someone starting an adventure. I returned as someone who'd been completely hollowed out by his own poor judgment. My sister picked me up at the airport and let me stay in her guest room while I figured out what came next. I was 60 years old with less than $40,000 to my name and no plan for the future. The studio apartment I'd rented before leaving for Mexico was occupied by someone else. My few remaining possessions were in a storage unit I'd have to pay to access. I had no business, no prospects, and no idea how to rebuild at my age. The hardest part wasn't the money. It was accepting how completely I'd been manipulated. My loneliness and desire for a fresh start had made me an easy target for someone who understood exactly what I needed to hear. I'd fallen in love not just with Isabella, but with the version of myself she'd reflected back to me. Successful, attractive, interesting, building something meaningful with someone who valued what I had to offer. Looking back now, the warning signs were obvious. Why would a successful, beautiful 34-year-old woman be genuinely interested in a recently divorced 59-year-old American with average looks and no particular charm? Why was she so eager to help me invest large amounts of money in properties I never properly researched? Why didn't I insist on being more involved in the legal and financial details of my own investments? I wanted to believe that I'd found something real, because the alternative was admitting that I was paying for the fantasy of being loved and needed. Isabella was brilliant at making me feel like the partnership was my idea, like I was the smart investor, and she was just the grateful local expert helping me succeed. 6 months after returning to Denver, I'm working at a hardware store, making $16 an hour, living in a one-bedroom apartment that costs more than the luxury condo I thought I owned in Mexico. I'm rebuilding from nothing at 60 years old, trying to save enough money to have some kind of retirement before I'm too old to work. Some days I feel philosophical about the experience, like I paid $300,000 for an expensive education about trust and human nature. Other days I feel stupid and angry, wondering how I could have been so blind to what was happening right in front of me. The worst days are when I remember how happy I felt during those months when I thought I was building something real with someone who cared about me. I still dream about the beaches sometimes, the warm weather, the feeling of possibility that came with starting over somewhere new. Mexico is a beautiful country with wonderful people, and I don't blame the place for what happened to me. I blame myself for being so eager to believe in a fantasy that I ignored every rational warning sign. If you're watching this and thinking about retiring abroad with your life savings, I'm not here to tell you not to do it, but I am here to tell you the part of the story people don't usually share, how easy it is to lose everything when you're lonely and desperate for a fresh start. How trust can be weaponized against you by people who understand exactly what you're missing in your life. The clock is ticking for all of us, but desperation makes terrible decisions. Don't let someone else's version of your dream cost you everything you've worked your whole life to build.